I picked out 4 main areas that I thought would be of most use in this kind of talk. First, just to talk about generally, what do we think is needed from as a policy framework, what is needed to enable climate-smart agriculture, sort of general features. And to give some examples, specific examples of how that could work and how we have seen it work. Then I would have a section that's talking about how to align climate change and agricultural policies, which is a big area of building a enabling policy framework. There's some interesting experience with that. And then final aspect is talking about financing CSA. Okay, good. Now I see it. And I suppose everybody else does too, right? Yep. So let me go to the next slide. How do I do that? Okay. So now this is I'll be talking about the first section, which is what do we mean? What are sort of the general features of a CSA enabling policy framework? And next slide. So how actually do I change those? Yeah, okay, maybe this is a bit basic, but to tell you the truth, in this last year, a couple of years of working with countries on policy, I think I've learned quite a bit about what do you actually need policy for, which is it's a very general kind of vision. It provides a vision of where you think you're going to go as a country or as a sector and articulates objectives. Most of the time policies will outline key areas for action and who would do it, say state sector, private sector, civil society. Overall, what policy needs to do, particularly when we're talking in the context of climate-smart agriculture, is to build an enabling environment and create incentives for getting the kinds of changes to meet the objectives that you've articulated. So that's sort of overall. The next slide. Let's see. Got it. Oops. Okay, so I gather a lot of the people participating today did participate in the earlier webinar, but even if you haven't, we can talk about what do you think, what is needed from a climate-smart agriculture policy environment to enable climate-smart agriculture. Well, one of the key things is climate-smart agriculture involves multiple objectives. It does involve looking at increasing food security and agriculture's role in increasing food security while adapting to climate change, but also reducing emissions growth. So you need a policy environment that can deal with multiple objectives, and that's one of the key aspects. Another one is that it's evidence-based and context-specific. We've seen just recently there's a lot of reports coming out about climate change and impacts on agriculture, the IPCC report that just came out this year. And what it shows is that there's quite a bit of, that the impacts are quite significant, and they vary a lot by location and time frame. So this needs to be taken into account when you're building a policy around agriculture. And finally, and this is really tricky, is climate change is increasing uncertainty tremendously. So you can't use your past expectations to look at the future. It's changing. We have a lot more uncertainty, so you need to have much more built into the policy to cope with uncertainty. And certainly an important aspect of that is focusing on risk management and also flexibility, moving away from defining one solution, okay, this is what everybody should do, to everybody should be enabled to figure out what they need to do because things are changing quickly. So another important point, though, is CSA enabling policies go way beyond the agricultural sector. So a lot of the building an enabling framework is also coordination and alignment with other policies. For example, the social policies and safety nets is certainly an important one that affects risk management and therefore has a lot of effects on climate-smart agriculture strategies that farmers can adopt. Also economic policies, disaster risk reduction, and in FAO, we consider agriculture to include fisheries and forestry, livestock, and crops. But in many countries, fisheries and forestry policies are separate. And so these also would need to be coordinated because there's quite a lot of linkage between the fishery, forestry, crop, and livestock sectors. So one of the key features of a CSA enabling policy environment is alignment across and coordination across these different kinds of policies, all that have effect for climate smart, the enabling of climate smart agriculture. So now let me move into a little more specifics about how policies can actually support CSA, to move from the general to the specific. One of the things is, as I just mentioned, okay, we know climate change is having impact. It's already having impacts on agriculture. It has impacts on which strategies will make the most sense to increase food security, for adaptation, and also reducing emissions. So one of the key things about policy to support CSA is recognition of the impacts of climate change and the necessity to take it into account, and recognition of its variable impacts. It's not just one thing that's going to hit the country, like temperatures increase 10%, that within a certain, even in pretty small countries, you can see quite varied impacts. For example, let me go to the next slide, which, okay, I'm sorry, it might be a little bit hard to figure out exactly what these two slides are showing, but I wanted to put this in to give an example from our work in Zambia, where we're looking at recent climate data and looking at where there's been, say, changes in the variability of rainfall. So that's what's shown on the graph on the left, and that's shown by agroecological region. Okay, we see that there's big differences between the agroecological regions of Zambia in terms of how much change there's been in the variation of rainfall. So some places have had much higher variability of rainfall, so that much more uncertainty. There's a lot more variability. People don't really know when it's coming, how much it's going to be, how long it's going to last. And that has a huge impact on the maize yield. The point of this slide is maize production and maize productivity increases is a major policy initiative in southern Africa. And so it's very important for a climate smart agriculture enabling policy to recognize that climate change is having effects. It's variable across different agroecological zones, and it needs to be inputted to the policy objectives and actions. Likewise, I put this slide in to show that there's variation across agroecological zone in terms of the yield and mitigation here being carbon sequestration, of different practices, say agroforestry in moist zones versus dry zones. Well, there's quite a bit of variation in how big an income or yield impact you would get and how big a mitigation impact. Without going into a lot of detail about the evidence base on this, because I know Siwa will cover much more, I think the main point in terms of policies is just to say, look, what's important about the policy is to recognize that climate change matters. It will change what is the best strategy for the given objective, and it will be heterogeneous within the country. Those are the sort of three main points about it. But, of course, it doesn't just matter that you recognize that climate change is important, it's you actually do something about it and try to get the enabling environment and the incentives in place. So, for example, one of the big barriers to adoption around improved seeds or the adapted seeds for adaptation is input supply, the seed supply. So another aspect of climate smart agriculture enabling policies is to address the specific barriers to adoption of the practices that have been identified as meeting the targeted objectives, taking into account the effects of climate change. So let's say we look at that maize yield data and the coefficient of variation of rainfall. We decide that there's certain kinds of maize varieties that we want to get out to a certain area. Well, you need to develop the seed supply, and in some cases, for example, there was experiments, ICRISAT was experimenting with private sector seed suppliers. And there's also information flows coming back from the farmers up to the policymakers, with biodiversity having a program called Seed for Needs, where they crowdsource. They give the farmers cell phones so that they can send back information about how the seeds do under the specific conditions. So this is an example of, okay, you have to identify what would make sense given the changing conditions of climate change, and then implement it, build some kind of implementation strategy that allows for flexibility and for information coming from the field as well as into from the top down. So let me go a little bit more on this whole issue of the enabling environment and incentives, because this is really a key issue that's come out in a lot of our analysis, is that we have a lot of good ideas on what needs to be done, and yet we still have a lot of problems with getting the farmers to adopt the practices and maintain them. So the role of policy in this case is really building an enabling environment that can maintain the capacity to adopt and the incentives to maintain these practices adopted. So another thing we've found in a lot of cases is that if you have a project come in that promotes a certain kind of strategy or practice, the farmers adopt, and then 2 years later everybody goes back when the project's finished. Okay, so what we're talking about from policy is that we need a long-term and permanent enabling environment and incentives, not just a one-off project kind of thing. And also, given the importance of the uncertainty that climate change brings and the need for risk management, there's even more emphasis on the need for information. Information flows to and from communities is a really key aspect of climate-smart agriculture enabling policy. I think I better hurry up. It's already 20 minutes in. And I still have a lot to go, so I might skip over a few things. I do want to say, though, in general, we had done a lot of synthesis of the literature and also from our own analysis in the countries we're working in. And we can see that some really key barriers to adoption come up again and again. One of them I've already mentioned, and that's input supply systems. The farmers can't get the seeds they need. They can't get the fertilizer they need in the amounts they need when they need. This is a big issue. In addition, this tenure security and tenure patterns, I would say even more broadly, have a big impact on the barriers to adoption. For example, in Southern Africa, conservation agriculture adoption is often hindered by the tenure patterns that allow open access grazing on farmers' fields after the harvest. Well, so the residues can't be collected and used for conservation ag. I've already said this information is quite an important issue. I'll say a little bit more about that in the next slide. And another one that's really a big issue, and this is something I'll come back to when I'm talking about climate finance.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Can you keep your question for later? Let's finish. Let Leslie finish her presentation, and then we'll have time for questions. Yeah. Leslie,
Okay.
yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I just wanted to make the case that one of the biggest barriers to adoption in a lot of these climate-smart agriculture practices that rely on building ecosystem services is that the farmers have reduced income for a period of time after they adopt. In this slide, what you can see is the farmer, right at the point of adoption, the income declines and then starts to increase over time. If you look at this over an entire 20-year period, it's a positive income flow. But you can have 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years of negative income. We need credit packages to support that kind of change. This is one of the biggest barriers we find. And so overcoming information barriers is a key aspect of climate-smart agriculture enabling policies. And that can be things like linking farmers to seasonal forecasts, building extension systems so they recognize the impacts of climate change in agricultural systems and its variability. And as I've already mentioned, this crowdsourcing to improve data sources, And a lot of it, I think, there's quite a bit of work also going on improving farmer-to-farmer information flows to help build adaptation practices.